April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The sky above the western shores of Okinawa was the kind of blue that belonged on a postcard, warm, clear, and deeply dishonest. Beneath it, stretching from horizon to horizon, the grey steel silhouettes of the largest naval armada the Pacific had ever witnessed crowded the water like a floating city. This was Operation Iceberg, the final, most colossal amphibious assault of World War II. Among the tens of thousands of men wading ashore that morning were the soldiers of the 381st Infantry Regiment, the backbone of the 96th Infantry Division. They called themselves the Deadeyes, a nickname born on a rifle range but baptized in blood during the savage liberation of the Philippines just months prior. Among these veterans walked Technical Sergeant Beaufort Theodore Anderson, Andy to anyone who knew him. At 27, he was not an imposing figure, 5 feet 7 inches tall, a slight 130 pounds, the kind of man who disappeared in a crowd. But the wiry frame was deceptive. Anderson had been built by Wisconsin winters and 18-hour workdays, not by any drill sergeant. Before the war, he had owned a small trucking operation, hauling farm equipment and dairy loads across frozen backroads that most men wouldn't dare drive in daylight. The trucks broke down constantly. The weather didn't care. Neither did the bills, so Anderson learned, early and thoroughly, what it meant to keep moving when every reasonable voice in his head said stop. When he enlisted in October 1942, he found basic training almost relaxing by comparison. "Nobody likes being shot at," he would say years later, with the flat delivery of a man describing the weather, "but I didn't even know what a day off was before I went into the army." He had already proven himself under fire on Leyte, sprinting across exposed ground to drag 2 wounded men to safety, an act that earned him the Bronze Star and the quiet respect of his regiment. But Leyte, brutal as it was, had been a different kind of war. Okinawa would be something else entirely. General Mitsuru Ushijima had made a deliberate choice: surrender the beaches, concede the north, and concentrate everything in the rugged southern terrain. His men had spent months turning every ridge, every cave, and every ancestral tomb into a killing position. They were not waiting to stop the Americans at the shore. They were waiting to bleed them slowly, methodically, in terrain where American air power and naval guns counted for very little, and the only thing that mattered was the man in front of you. The Deadeyes were not marching toward a battle. They were marching toward a place designed, from the ground up, to destroy them. As the 96th Division pushed south, the deceptive ease of the landing evaporated. The American advance slammed violently into the Makinato Line, the first of Ushijima's 3 major defensive belts. The linchpin of this line was a jagged, coral spine known as Kakazu Ridge. To the uninitiated eye, Kakazu did not look like a mountain. It rose only about 11 meters above sea level, a calcified coral formation stretching roughly 1,000 yards. However, its geology made it a fortress more formidable than any concrete bunker. The ridge was honeycombed with natural caves and crevices, but its most distinct features were the ancestral tombs. For centuries, the Ryukyu clans of Okinawa had carved large, lyre-shaped burial chambers into the limestone hillsides to house their dead. These tombs, constructed with thick, fitted stone walls and heavy roofs, were bomb-proof and bulletproof. The Japanese defenders had desecrated these sacred spaces, transforming them into fortified machine gun nests, command posts, and mortar positions. When the 381st Infantry launched its first major assault on the ridge at 0500 hours on April 9th, they unknowingly entered a nightmarish cauldron. The Japanese had pre-sighted every approach. As the Americans climbed the slopes, they were met with a wall of interlocking fire from weapons they could not see. Mortars rained down from the reverse slopes. Machine guns chattered from the dark mouths of the tombs. The fighting devolved instantly into a primal, close-quarters struggle involving satchel charges, flamethrowers, and bayonets. For days, the 96th Division threw itself against the ridge, suffering a staggering 1,510 casualties without securing the objective. By April 12th, the situation had reached a bloody stalemate. Anderson's battalion had attacked the ridge 3 times that day alone, pushing into the teeth of the enemy defences, only to be repulsed each time by the sheer density of fire. The men were exhausted, their nerves frayed by the constant concussion of explosives and the stench of death that hung heavy in the humid air. As evening approached, the fighting seemed to lull, but the veterans knew better. The Japanese doctrine emphasized the night attack, the psychological terror of infiltration under the cover of darkness. The premonition of danger became reality at 1900 hours on April 12th. The sky to the south lit up as Japanese artillery opened a barrage of terrifying intensity. It was the heaviest, most coordinated bombardment the 96th Division had faced in the entire Pacific War. For hours, the earth shook as heavy shells pounded the American lines. Then, ominously, the barrage shifted. The shells began to scream over the heads of the frontline troops, impacting deep in the rear areas. This was the classic signature of a major counterattack. Isolate the front line by cutting off communications and supply routes, then strike the forward positions with infantry. The Japanese 32nd Army had ordered a massive offensive, designating 4 battalions to punch a hole in the American lines. Spearheading this assault in Anderson's sector was the 272nd Independent Infantry Battalion, commanded by Captain Shimada. Their objective was a specific tactical weakness in the American line, a ravine, or saddle, that separated Kakuzu Ridge from a neighboring formation known as Kakuzu West. The environmental conditions favored the attackers perfectly. It was the night of April 12th, leading into the morning of April 13th. The moon was a mere sliver, providing only 4.5% illumination. The visibility was near zero, a suffocating blanket of blackness that hid the movement of hundreds of men. The temperature hovered around 18 degrees Celsius, cool enough to keep the moving soldiers from overheating, but doing nothing to dampen the tension. At 0300 hours, the silence of the ravine was shattered. A column of approximately 75 Japanese soldiers, moving with the discipline and stealth of seasoned night fighters, crashed directly into the flank of Company A. Standing in their path was a single mortar squad, 8 men led by Technical Sergeant Beaufort Anderson. The collision was violent and immediate. The Japanese initiated the assault with a barrage of knee mortars, Type 89 grenade discharges, and hand grenades, followed instantly by a fanatical charge. In seconds, the tranquility of the night was replaced by the chaotic noise of combat, the scream of men, the crack of rifles, and the thudding explosions of grenades. Anderson's squad was devastated in the opening volley. All 8 of his men were wounded by shrapnel or small arms fire. In this moment of absolute chaos, Anderson's leadership instincts overrode any sense of self-preservation. He knew his men were incapacitated and defenseless in the open. Spotting one of the large Okinawan tombs nearby, a stone chamber measuring about 8.5 meters wide and 2.4 meters tall, he ordered his wounded squad to crawl inside. The thick limestone walls would provide the only sanctuary against the storm of steel outside. Once his men were inside, Anderson made a decision that would define his legacy. He did not follow them into the depths of the tomb to cower. Instead, he took up a position at the narrow entrance, standing as the sole barrier between the slaughter of his squad and the advancing enemy column. He raised his M1 carbine and opened fire. The Japanese were close, point-blank range. Anderson fired rapidly, the muzzle flash of his weapon illuminating the terrifying faces of the charging soldiers in strobe-like bursts. He emptied a 15-round magazine, watching 6 enemy soldiers crumple to the ground. He reached for a fresh magazine, his fingers scraping against the canvas of his ammunition pouches. They were empty. He had fired his last round. The enemy, sensing the pause in fire, surged forward. A Japanese soldier hurled a grenade that tumbled through the tomb entrance, landing just 2 meters from Anderson's boots. It was a death sentence, with a 4-second fuse. Reacting with a speed born of pure adrenaline, Anderson scooped up the explosive device mid-bounce and hurled it back into the darkness. It detonated seconds later, right in the midst of the Japanese column. The blast brought him a momentary reprieve, 10 seconds of confusion among the attackers, but he knew it wasn't enough. He was unarmed, outnumbered 70-1, and guarding a tomb full of wounded men. As Anderson scrambled in the darkness of the tomb's entrance, his hand brushed against rough wood. It was a crate, partially buried under rubble and debris, likely abandoned during an earlier American withdrawal or supply drop. He pried it open. Inside, illuminated only by the sporadic flashes of distant explosions, lay 24 rounds of ammunition. But they were not carbine bullets. They were M49A2 60mm high-explosive mortar shells. For a moment, they seemed useless. A mortar shell is designed to be part of a system. It requires a steel tube, a base plate to absorb the recoil, and a bipod for aiming. The user drops the shell down the tube, where gravity carries it to a fixed firing pin at the bottom. The pin strikes the primer, igniting the propellant charge, which launches the shell and simultaneously arms the impact fuse. Without the tube, the shell is just a heavy, inert cylinder of steel and TNT. Anderson, however, was a mortarman. He knew the weapon's anatomy intimately. He knew that the M49, a two projectile, weighed 1.38 kilograms, roughly 3 pounds. He knew it had an effective kill radius of 27 meters, 3 times that of a standard hand grenade. And most importantly, he understood the mechanics of the fuse. The safety pin prevented accidental detonation, but once pulled, the fuse was technically live. However, to actually arm the explosive train, to make it explode on impact, the primer in the tail needed to be struck with sufficient force to simulate the firing pin of a mortar tube. This would ignite a delay element, giving the round 4 to 5 seconds before the main charge detonated. In the desperate calculus of the moment, Anderson formulated a plan that appeared in no field manual. He would be the mortar tube. At 03:36 hours, Anderson grabbed the first shell. He pulled the safety pin. The Japanese were regrouping, their voices audible, just 40 meters down the slope. Anderson turned to the wall of the tomb. It was constructed of irregular limestone blocks, fitted without mortar, hard, unyielding stone. He held the shell by its body, tail fin pointing down. He had to strike the base against the stone wall with exactly the right amount of force. If he hit it too softly, the primer wouldn't ignite, and he would be throwing a dud. If he hit it too hard, the sheer shock could detonate the main charge instantly, vaporizing him and his squad. He swung. Clack. He felt the metallic engagement of the primer, a sensation transmitted through the steel casing to his hand. The fuse was armed. A chemical train was now burning inside the shell. He had less than 5 seconds. Anderson stepped out of the protection of the tomb. He had played baseball in high school, and the motion came back to him now. He wound up and threw the 3-pound steel football into the black void of the ravine. The shell arced through the night air. The shell impacted the ground 30 meters away. The explosion was deafening, a flat, cracking roar that dwarfed the sound of grenades. The blast wave slapped against the limestone face of the ridge, and the whine of jagged steel fragments slicing through the air followed instantly. Screams erupted from the ravine. Anderson didn't wait to admire his handiwork. He was already reaching into the crate for the second shell. The process became a terrifying, mechanical rhythm. Grab shell, pull pin, slam against wall, throw. Shell number 2 landed at 32 meters. 4 more Japanese soldiers went down. Shell number 3 landed at 28 meters. 5 more casualties. The Japanese assault force was bewildered. They were being hit by heavy ordnance that seemed to be raining down with impossible accuracy from a source they couldn't visually identify. The psychological impact was devastating. A mortar barrage usually meant a team of men operating a crew-served weapon from a distance, yet the fire was coming from a single point, just up the slope. The enemy soldiers, realizing they were in a kill zone, began to adapt. They shouted orders, spreading out laterally to minimize the damage from the explosions. Anderson, listening to the shouts and the movement of rocks, realized their tactic. He adjusted his own. He stopped aiming for the center of the ravine. Instead, he began throwing shells to the far left and far right flanks. The explosions forced the Japanese soldiers to scramble back toward the center for cover, directly into the path of his next throws. He was herding them like cattle, manipulating their movements with high explosives. But the enemy was not passive. At 03:43 hours, they pinpointed the source of the devastation. A Japanese soldier managed to creep within throwing range and lobbed a Type 97 hand grenade toward the tomb entrance. Anderson saw the small, dark object silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky and dove to his left. He wasn't fast enough. The grenade detonated against the far wall of the entrance. A spray of shrapnel swept across the chamber. A jagged fragment of steel, described later as being the size of a cigarette, tore through his trousers and punched deep into his left thigh. The impact felt like the kick of a mule. Anderson collapsed, gasping as a searing heat spread through his leg. Blood began to pour from the wound, soaking his trousers and pooling on the limestone floor. Inside the tomb, his men shouted for him to stay down, to drag himself inside and let them try to hold the entrance. Anderson ignored them. He knew that if he stopped, the Japanese would rush the position. The grenade throwers were only 25 meters away now. He forced himself upright, putting his weight on his good leg. He grabbed shell number 6. His hands were becoming numb from the repeated violent impacts against the stone wall. His palms were bruised and swollen. The blood from his leg wound had slicked the floor, making his footing treacherous, and smeared onto his hands, making the smooth steel of the mortar shells slippery. He slammed the shell against the wall. Clack! He threw. The throw was weaker this time, landing short at 23 meters. The concussion shook dust from the ceiling of the tomb, but the explosion kept the enemy at bay. For the next 30 minutes, the duel continued. Anderson fought through a haze of pain and blood loss. His vision began to tunnel, a physiological symptom of the hypovolemic shock setting in. Yet, he kept throwing. Shell number 10, shell number 11, shell number 12. The Japanese advance had stalled completely. The ferocious charge had disintegrated into a cautious, terrified crawl. The soldiers in the ravine were no longer trying to break through. They were trying to survive the madman on the ridge. By 04:15 hours, Anderson had thrown 16 mortar shells. He had essentially operated a one-man artillery battery for nearly an hour. The crate was empty. He stood panting in the doorway, gripping his combat knife, prepared to fight hand-to-hand if they rushed him now. But help was arriving. The chaos of the counterattack had finally been relayed to the heavy support units. Offshore, American naval destroyers trained their 5-inch guns on the coordinates of the ravine. The air began to whistle as the naval shells came in, walking a rolling barrage across the area just south of Anderson's position. The ground heaved under the impacts. The barrage lasted 15 minutes, turning the approach routes into an inferno of churned earth and shrapnel. When the naval guns fell silent, a profound stillness descended on the ravine. Anderson strained his ears, listening for the scuff of boots or the whisper of commands. There was nothing. The only sound was the ringing in his ears and the ragged quality of his own breathing. The sun began to crest the horizon around 0700 hours, casting a pale light over the battlefield. The scene revealed in the ravine was gruesome. The bodies of Japanese soldiers lay scattered across the rocky ground. Anderson, leaning against the tomb entrance, counted 14 visible corpses from his vantage point. Later, patrol sweeps would confirm that 25 enemy soldiers lay dead directly in front of his position, all victims of the improvised mortar shells. The 272nd Battalion had been decimated. The survivors had retreated to the Shuri line. Anderson's uniform was saturated with blood from his hip to his knee. The makeshift bandage applied by his squad medic during a lull was soaked through. The pain was excruciating, a constant throbbing that synchronized with his heartbeat. His men urged him to wait for a litter team, but Anderson refused. He was the ranking non-commissioned officer, and he had a report to make. He pushed himself off the wall and began to walk. The company command post was located in a captured Japanese bunker 250 meters away. To a healthy man, it was a short sprint. To Anderson, it was a marathon. Every step sent shockwaves of pain through his leg. He left a visible trail of bright red blood on the white limestone rocks as he limped eastward. The journey took him 20 minutes. When he finally stumbled into the command post, the officers were stunned by his appearance. He was pale, shaking, and covered in grime and blood. He drew himself up to attention, offered a salute, and delivered his report with professional detachment. Enemy attack repelled. Mortar squad position held. Estimated 25 enemy killed. Request permission to return to position. The company commander looked at the trail of blood behind the sergeant and the ghastly wound in his thigh. The request was absurdly heroic. Permission denied, the commander said gently. Immediate evacuation ordered. At 08:30 hours, Anderson was lifted onto a litter rack, attached to a jeep, an improvised ambulance for the rough terrain. The ride to the field hospital near Kadena Airfield took 90 agonizing minutes over bomb-cratered roads. When he arrived, the trauma surgeons assessed the damage. They found that the piece of shrapnel had tracked through his thigh with terrifying precision. It had missed his femoral artery by less than 2 centimeters. Had the fragment struck just a fraction of an inch to the right, Beaufort Anderson would have bled to death in minutes on the floor of that tomb. His squad would have been overrun, the American flank would have collapsed, and the Japanese counterattack might have succeeded in penetrating the rear echelon, altering the course of the Battle for Okinawa. Anderson spent 3 weeks in the hospital. He underwent surgery to remove the steel and bone fragments and endured the painful process of physical therapy. But his thoughts remained with his men. When he finally regained consciousness after surgery, his first question was about his squad. He wept when he was told that all 8 men had survived the night. The war ended for Anderson, but his story was slowly making its way up the chain of command. The evidence was irrefutable. The sworn statements of 8 survivors, the body count in the ravine, and the empty crate of mortar shells. On June 27, 1946, more than a year after that dark night on Kakuzu Ridge, Beaufort T. Anderson stood in the East Room of the White House. President Harry S. Truman draped the pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation read that Anderson's indomitable spirit, fearless leadership, and offensive power had saved his unit. It noted the tactical innovation of using mortar shells as hand grenades, a feat that military historians would later study as a singular example of adaptability, though one strictly forbidden in modern training due to the extreme danger involved. Yet, Anderson did not let the medal define him. He returned to civilian life with the same work ethic that had carried him through the Wisconsin winters. He settled in California, re-enlisted in the Army Reserves, served during the Korean War, and eventually retired as a second lieutenant. He built a successful floor-covering business, raised a family, and served his community as the mayor of Seaside, California, and later as a Monterey County supervisor. For decades, many of his neighbors, and even some close friends, had no idea that the quiet, unassuming man who raised cattle on his ranch near Fort Hunter Liggett was a recipient of the nation's highest military honor. He rarely spoke of the war. He didn't attend many reunions, and when he did, he sat in the back, listening rather than speaking. "I've lived the same life as anyone else," he told a reporter years later. "I'm very proud of the fact I've got it, but I don't dote on the fact I've got it." Beaufort Theodore Anderson passed away on November 7, 1996, at the age of 74. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 12, Grave 47. His headstone is simple, bearing only his name, rank, and the words Medal of Honor. It does not tell the story of the limestone tomb, the 24 mortar shells, or the 50 minutes he stood alone against an army. It doesn't need to. That story is etched into the history of the US Army, a testament to the fact that on a dark ridge in Okinawa, one man with a crate of rusty ammunition and a refusal to quit proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit is the most formidable weapon of all.